Okay, this is part 9, and today we're going to be doing some live shooting. I'm going to take you through all of the thought processes and button presses in different lighting conditions. And today we're going to be shooting my friend here, Wally. And what do you think of that, Wally? Okay, I just want to apologise in advance for the rough and ready nature of this video. I'm using an unstabilised lens, so the footage might be a bit shaky. Right, so we're outside to start with, and the first thing that I tend to think of on a subconscious level is how much light have I got to work with, what sort of weather am I dealing with. Today is a sort of mixture of sunshine and clouds, which can be quite good for shooting, particularly if the clouds are over the sun, because that gives us a nice diffused soft light. You might have noticed just in this last few seconds the patch of sunlight has disappeared from the grass there, so it's a constantly changing lighting scenario. But even so, when the sun's out, this part of the lawn closest to us is in shade, so I know that I'm safe to use this area because I'm not going to get any harsh sunlight on my subject that's going to create any harsh shadows. So the other thing I'm thinking in terms of composition is Wally is obviously not very tall, so we need to get down low to somewhere around his eye level. The other thing I'm thinking is that a concrete patio is not a particularly nice place for him to be standing. I could put him on the grass, but I think I'm going to drop him down just in front of the grass here. And then the next thing I do is I'll reach for my camera. I've no idea what settings are currently dialed into this camera, so the first thing I'll do is just turn the camera on and see what the display shows me. Now, if the display doesn't light up like this, you'll just have to hit the Q button or the equivalent on your camera. You'll tend to find that if you have an LCD display on the top here, then the information will be displayed there, so your screen might be off by default. On this one, this old 550D, we don't have a top display, so the screen comes on automatically. The display shows us that we're in manual mode, a 15th of a second, f5.6, and the lowest ISO that this camera can go to, which is 200. Now, if I want the camera to meter the scene, I have to half press the shutter button just to see what that tells me. So if I do that, none of the settings are going to change because I'm in manual mode at the moment. But I can see from this meter here that the dot is roughly 1.5 notches, 1.5 stops above the 0, and that's telling me that the photo is going to be overexposed. If I just take a shot quickly, let's frame it a bit better, we can see that that's an overexposed photo. So that is what this here is indicating. You'll also see this meter in the bottom of the viewfinder if you look through there. So it's something to keep your eye on if you're in a manual mode. But as I said in my earlier video, part 5, if I've got plenty of light to work with, I will tend to put the camera into aperture priority mode, and I know that the camera is always going to give me a reasonably good exposure. It's always going to put that marker in the center there. Now if I half press the shutter, I'm at f1.8 with this nifty 50 plastic fantastic 50mm lens that I introduced you to in part 2. This is an f1.8 lens, so for portraits, if I want a nice blurry background, I can use the wheel here to dial my f number down to f1.8, half press the shutter, and I see that it's giving me a nice fast shutter speed of a 500th of a second. Now for this shoot, Wally's not going to be moving obviously, and I'm going to set this camera down on this mini tripod, so shutter speed isn't really an issue anyway. But when we move indoors into low light, I'll hand hold and illustrate how I shoot when we have less light, and shutter speed and ISO may well be issues. So thus far we've thought about composition, how much light we've got, put the camera into aperture priority mode. Because we want a blurred background, we've dialed our f number down to f1.8, half press the shutter. We're happy with all the settings, and our light meter here is showing us that there are no issues with under and overexposure. So I'm going to just set the camera down and frame up my shot. Okay, now ordinarily I will be looking through the viewfinder here to frame my shot, but that's a bit tricky while I'm filming this, so I will show you what's happening in the viewfinder. But just for the purposes of this video, to make things easier, I'm going to also use the display on the back of the camera. And the way I'm going to do that is by putting the camera into what we call live view mode. To get into live view mode, we push this button here, and then we can see what the camera sees by looking at the display on the back of the camera. Now, more by luck than anything else, we see that Wally is not only actually in focus, but he's also on one of these grid lines. Let me just zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. Now I wanted to show you this on the back of the camera's display because I wanted to illustrate a compositional technique known as the rule of thirds. As I mentioned in part 2, sometimes putting our subject right in the centre of the frame is not the most pleasing composition. If we move our subject so that it is a third of the way across the screen, as indicated by this vertical line here, that will in many situations give us a much more appealing look to our shot. So I'm just framing this up as I would normally do by looking through the viewfinder. Ordinarily our focus point will be set to the centre of the frame. Now in live view the focus point is indicated by this white box. When we look through the viewfinder we have a series of red dots, and older cameras tend to have fewer focus points. This old 550D has just got the 9 points. So in order to make sure that the camera focuses on my subject and not on the background, as it's done there, I need to move my focus point. Now I'll illustrate how this is done both on this display and also by looking through the viewfinder. Now I'm just going to remind you how we choose our focus point. I covered this in part 2 of the series. We push this button on the top right of the camera, in the case of a Canon. Now it may default to automatic selection, whereby the camera just chooses whichever point it thinks we want it to use, or it may default to the central focus point, but we can override that by using these buttons here, these directional buttons, and tell the camera which point we want it to use. Just quickly switching back to live view mode, I'll do that. I'll do the live view equivalent of that. We want to focus on
the closest eye to the camera, half press the shutter button, and we've locked focus. Full press takes the photo. And that is pretty much all there is to it when we're shooting in good light. Of course, we can introduce flash into the equation, but I'll be covering that in a later video. So let's move on to a different lighting scenario.
Okay, moving on to our second lighting scenario. This is a situation that a lot of people struggle with. Our subject is indoors, but is in front of a window. This is actually it's a patio door. And as you can probably see just from the video, my video camera is seeing all that bright light outside, and so it's exposing, it's adjusting its settings for the light outside, but our subject is indoors, so our subject is being underexposed. If I just get a bit closer to the subject, you can see that becomes all the more apparent. So how do we get around this? Let me just pick up my camera. In fact, we'll take a quick photo with the camera. I'm just having to guess. Okay, and you can see there that Wally is very dark in the shot. So how do we get around this one? Okay, we're still in aperture priority, we're still getting decent shutter speeds. So the way to get around this is to hit the Q button, use the arrow buttons to navigate to our little light meter here. Now this is giving us control over what we call exposure compensation, and by rotating the dial that I have introduced you to before now, we can increase the brightness of the image. So the way that exposure compensation works is the camera still decides what it thinks the correct exposure should be, but whatever the camera thinks, it'll then adjust the exposure upwards by the number of increments that we've told the camera to, in inverted commas, overexpose by. 1 is 1 stop, so we're getting twice as much light. 2 would be 2 stops, twice as much light again. So let's just go to +1 and take the photo again and see what we get. Now I'm not going to frame the shot properly because I'm just holding the camera without looking through the viewfinder. But we can see straight away that Wally is a lot brighter than he was. I'm just going to step back a little bit and hit the Q button again, rotate the dial, let's put it up to 2 stops. Give it another go. And there we can see that Wally is more or less correctly exposed. One thing to remember to do is when you finish shooting in a challenging lighting situation like this, make sure to hit that Q button again and put your exposure compensation back to 0. Otherwise, next time you go to shoot, you'll find that all your images are overexposed and you won't be quite sure why. Okay, final scenario, low light. Apologies if the camera struggles to focus. It really is quite dark in here. So how do we set up the camera in low light? When I'm in low light, as I've mentioned in earlier videos, I tend to put the camera into the scary manual mode. hitting that Q button, I can navigate to the ISO, which I will tend to set to the auto. Q button, I can open my aperture as wide as possible. Because I've switched to manual mode, I have to reset that. Half press the shutter. Shutter speed, I'm hand holding. Okay, Wally's not moving at all, but let's assume Wally was a person who's moving about a bit. I'm going to need to crank up my shutter speed. Let's try a 40th of a second. Half press. That gives me an ISO of 3200, which is not ideal, but in this situation where it's very low light, I'm either going to have to accept a higher ISO than I would like, or a slower shutter speed than I would ideally like. The way I've got the camera set up, it's maxing out at 3200 ISO, and if I pay attention to my light meter here, we can see that that little dot is below the 0. So at a 40th of a second, my shot's going to be underexposed. So I'm going to have to slow the shutter and watch the little dot move. At a 25th of a second, it's almost there. 20th of a second seems to be about ideal. So I'm going to try hand holding the shot without being able to see through the viewfinder to frame up the shot, without being able to steady the camera particularly well. I'm going to have to go to live view mode because we're having trouble with focusing. And there we have a correctly exposed, correctly focused photo in low light. That one was just ever so slightly blurred, and as I've said in an earlier video, take a number of shots and probably one of them will be nice and sharp. So that was camera settings and thought processes in 3 different types of lighting conditions. I hope that was of some use to you. Special thanks to Wally, and if you enjoyed this, please give it a quick thumbs up, like, share, subscribe, and thank you for watching.